Può essere prodotto dal calore del sole e dalla forza del vento, per fornire energia pulita a case, mezzi di trasporto, industrie, ovunque nel mondo. Può essere facilmente trasportato e stoccato, sfruttando le infrastrutture esistenti a costi contenuti. Snam sta affrontando questa sfida mettendo in campo tecnologie e competenze. Perché quello che facciamo oggi darà vita al pianeta di domani. Snam. Energy to inspire the world. La qualità della vita è strettamente legata all'energia. Ma il nostro modello di sviluppo e l'utilizzo delle risorse energetiche non sono più sostenibili. Dobbiamo decarbonizzare il pianeta puntando su energie rinnovabili e pulite. La nostra strategia per uno sviluppo sostenibile punta su gas rinnovabili come l'idrogeno. L'idrogeno è un elemento chimico essenziale ed è il più abbondante nell'universo. Può essere prodotto dal calore del sole e dalla forza del vento, per fornire energia pulita a case, mezzi di trasporto, industrie, ovunque nel mondo. Può essere facilmente trasportato e stoccato, sfruttando le infrastrutture esistenti a costi contenuti. Snam sta affrontando questa sfida mettendo in campo tecnologie e competenze. Perché quello che facciamo oggi darà vita al pianeta di domani. Snam. Energy to inspire the world.
Good morning. This is the Critical Conference operator. Welcome and thank you for joining the Snam 2019-2023 Strategic Plan Conference Call. As a reminder, all participants are in listen-only mode. After the presentation, there will be an opportunity to ask questions. Should anyone need assistance during the conference call, they may signal an operator by pressing star and 0 on their telephone. At this time, I would like to turn the conference over to Mr. Marco Alverà, CEO of Snam. Please go ahead, sir.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome to Snam's 2019-2023 strategy presentation. Thank you to all of those who've joined us here at our Milan headquarters and to those who are following us remotely. In 2019, for the 12th year in a row, Snam completed our Capex plan on time and on budget. Over the last 4 years, we've consistently delivered on our strategy. We've grown our asset base, delivering almost 900 kilometers of new pipelines. We've acquired regulated businesses in Italy, Austria, and Greece, and substantially de-risked the on-time completion of the TAP project. Our efficiency plan has contributed to an overall reduction in core business costs of almost 9% since 2016. As the energy transition becomes more crucial, we are increasing our role and exposure and have insourced distinctive competences and technologies that have allowed us to launch 3 new businesses where we are making good progress. Meanwhile, we've reduced the cost of financing by 40% and increased our cash return to shareholders. Whilst we're executing our strategic plan, the outlook for gas infrastructure has improved markedly. Global gas consumption has grown by 9% over the last 2 years, driven by environmental objectives and ample gas availability. Meanwhile, prospects for the development of green and low carbon gas have improved, highlighting the long-term value of gas assets to reach deep decarbonization targets. The combination of our performance and delivery on the strategy and the more favorable market gives us great confidence in the future prospects of Snam. Our delivery since 2016 has consistently produced superior results. Our asset base has grown by over 7.5%, with inflation lower than 1% per year. On top of this, we have cut costs. Our efficiency plan will deliver about 50 million euros of savings by 2019, 2 years ahead of schedule. Net income is expected to increase 28%, considering we now forecast 2019 results to be at the higher end of our previous range for guidance. Thanks to the buyback program and the 106 million shares cancelled, EPS grew by 32%. The growth in EPS has enabled us to increase our DPS policy to 5% annual growth to 2022, at the same time reducing our payout from above 90% to below 75%. We are fully committed to ESG in everything we do, and have been the first listed company to create a dedicated ESG board committee. Tackling methane leakage is one of the defining issues of the gas industry. On this front, we've launched a leak detection and remediation campaign, which involved 130,000 on-field measurements. Starting from a 2016 base of 48 billion cubic meters, which is less than 0.07% of transported gas, our program will enable us to reduce CH4 emissions by over 15% this year and raise our ambition going forward. The Snam Foundation is continuing to invest in strategic projects for the benefit of the communities in which we work. We've enshrined gender policy in our company bylaws, and we're also one of the 4 companies worldwide to be part of the Global Forum of Transparency International, and we actively support the OECD on spreading the values of integrity and transparency. We continue to invest in the training and well-being of our colleagues and run the business with a deep sense of purpose and belonging. We are very proud that Snam has been included in the prestigious Forbes list of 150 best companies to work for in the world, and we are second in Italy behind Ferrari. This attention to long-term sustainability positions us strongly with all stakeholders and, of course, is also supportive of a reduction in our overall cost of capital, attracting both equity and debt ESG-focused investors. Let's now look at the key findings of our global gas report, which is available in the room today as well as on our website. Global gas demand rose by around 5% last year. That's over 3 times the long-term historical trend. This was driven by fast-growing LNG supply that have lowered costs globally, and also by China's continuing positive effort on air quality. This growth trend is expected to carry on for some time, implying significant new infrastructure requirements. Upstream costs for 70% of global proven reserves are now below $3 per million BTU, and the ample LNG capacity that is set to come on stream will support affordability and be a main driver of cheap gas, particularly in the summer. This fall in the price of gas, you can see on the right part of the chart, has either closed or is closing the gap with coal-fired power generation. We are already in switching territory in Europe, where there is stronger CO2 costs, while even for emerging countries, who unfortunately are continuing to build new coal plants, now the cost of switching to gas is falling rapidly. Gas in Italy is also performing way above expectations, with volumes increased 12% since 2015. Determining over the same period, given revenues have been basically flat, a 10% reduction in the average cost of transport for consumers in Italy, which is contributing to making gas even more competitive. Looking more closely at 2019, we're expecting an overall increase of around 4.5% year on year. This is driven by a 12% increase in the power sector alone, where dry conditions mean less hydropower and maintenance abroad means less imports, and generation from gas has increased over coal. You can see on the right-hand part of the chart, there's been a very meaningful inversion in the historical gas premium over coal when you factor in CO2, and this is for Italy. And this trend is set to gain even more pace as the official deadline for the coal phase-out of 2025 nears, and we see increasing appetite for new connections to our pipe to build gas plants in Italy. Looking ahead, we need a tenfold increase in our effort to decarbonize Europe. The current pathway, as we know, is not going to get us to where we need to be. So we need to move from 0.8 reduction per year to around 8.5 reduction per year. The true challenge of this steep increase in decarbonization is how to decarbonize the 40% of consumption which is very difficult or incredibly expensive to electrify. This is represented in the green blocks of the chart. For example, high pressure processes in industry, very heavy transport, or heating in cold weathers in the winter. Finally, industrial strategies and government policies are aligning around the idea that green gases will play an essential role. In fact, France has recently stated a 10% renewable gas targets for the country. Snam and other TSOs are now promoting a target for a hydrogen blend of up to 10% by 2030, which could raise to 20% afterwards. And we're waiting for Germany to publish its ambitious hydrogen strategy in a few weeks' time. CCS also is finally back on the agenda, with Germany, with Norway leading the way on the implementation and some joint projects with the UK as well. On the financing side, you will have seen that the EIB has recently stated that it will continue to support the growth of low-carbon gas, also through investment and adaptation of the existing natural gas infrastructure. The growing role of green hydrogen that we've focused on recently in a global event in Rome is strongly supported by the steep fall in hydrogen costs. Costs have already come down by over 500 euros per megawatt hour to 110 today, and this, as you can see in the bottom part of the chart, is largely due to the very steep fall in solar and wind costs that we have all seen. The trend will continue, and the next stage of the trend will be accelerated by what we believe will be fall in the cost of the Capex for electrolyzers. The good news here is that there's a lot of room to drive this lowering of the costs. This still is a very small niche market, and a lot of these equipments are still essentially handmade, and so there's a lot of room for industrialization and mass production and lowering of costs. So overall, the cost trajectory for green hydrogen suggests that it could already become competitive with gray hydrogen and some fossil fuels in applications such as long distance heavy transport and some industrial applications already before 2030. The central role of gas in the energy transition is recognized by the Italian regulator here and underpins the stability and visibility of our framework. Over the last 12 months, for instance, we've seen the worsening spreads that have been fairly reflected in our WACC formula, as well as an extension of the regulatory period for storage to 6 years. Meanwhile, we're having constructive conversations with the regulator on system requirements to maintain the health of the asset over the long term. This has to do with the replacements, and also the most effective way of delivering these replacements, both for Snam and for the system overall. We're also working on appropriate performance incentives to improve the way the market works and continue to provide better quality services to the shippers and to the market participants. On both of these important issues, discussions are on track, and we expect to have a definition in the course of 2020. With regards to the energy transition, we're very pleased with the work that we've done jointly with Terna. This is something that the regulator has promoted and asked for. And as you can see in the 3 scenarios, which is a business as usual, a centralized scenario, and a decentralized scenario, we essentially have a flat consumption for gas in Italy seen and agreed between us and Terna until 2040, and we have a very big and increasing role for renewable green gases and CCS, which you see here can reach exceed 26 BCM by 2040. So our strong delivery, coupled with a favorable market environment, underpins our strategic plan to 2023, in which essentially we've increased the Capex to 6.5 billion euros, up from 5.7 in the previous plan. The increase is mainly driven by 400 million euros of additional investment in replacements that are required to offset the aging of the network, 300 million of additional investments to install the electric compressors that we will put alongside our current gas compressor stations to go dual fuel, and investments also to digitalize the network. And we also include in the transport Capex 140 million euros of connections to our grid for new biomethane plants and CNG stations, and this is up from 90 million that we were expecting last year. In this plan, we've doubled our investments in the energy transition to 400 million euros. These are not part of our RAB, but we've built business models that have essentially a similar risk profile to the RAB, but generate higher returns to those we get on the RAB. Looking at our key regulated projects, a few things I would like to highlight are the 55-kilometer interconnection between TAP and our own network in Puglia. That is progressing well and is on track. The Sardinia network, which is confirmed in our plan and is quantified at an amount of 400 million euros of Capex in the planned period. And as I mentioned, the dual fuel compressor project, which has three main advantages for the system. Not only it reduces CO2 emissions from the combustion of the fuel gas that we use, it increases the efficiency of the compression itself, lowering the energy costs, but also it provides flexibility to the overall system, and it provides flexibility to the electric system too, because we will then be able to run both machines and arbitrage between the two markets, not only to save costs, but also to help the electricity network become more resilient and balanced and stable in light of an expected continuing increase of renewable energy. As I mentioned, we're also planning to replace about 1,000 kilometers of transport pipelines. About half of that length is already either authorized or already under construction. The way we determine what to replace and the replacement priorities is basically on a statistical analysis of what we call our asset health. So this includes looking at the characteristic of the asset itself, the terrain in which the asset lays, the operational conditions, and that's the top priority. After that, we look at service continuity, then we look at operational resilience, including also environmental and societal priorities that may have to do with different urban development now compared to when we built some of these pipelines 50 years ago. So there's a model in place that we use to prioritize the very significant replacements that we will need to do in the coming decades. The investment opportunities we've outlined enable us to confirm a growth in RAB of 2.5% per year out to 2023, in line with what was our previous plan, despite the fact that we now are using a lower deflator of 0.8 as opposed to 1.1 in the previous plan. Looking further ahead, we confirm a long-term outlook of 1% real growth per year all the way to 2030. And we have visibility over the long-term Capex requirement, mainly because of what I said regarding the replacement needs. The 1,000 kilometers that we will add, that we will replace over the next 4 years, will be offset almost entirely by an additional 1,000 kilometers aging during the same period. So we will finish in 2023 with 9,000 kilometers still fully amortized, which is similar to what we have today. The share of our Capex, which is dedicated to what we call Snam Tech, which is our program that brings together all our investments in technology, in the energy transition, and in energy efficiency. Snamtech has risen from 850 to 1.4 billion. Of the 1.41 billion is regulated. This includes investments in energy efficiency, in innovation of our own assets, for example, in leak detection and repair campaigns. We have investments in technology. Part of our effort is to continue to implement and install sensors that are becoming much cheaper than they were before, scattered all around our infrastructure, and use these sensors to collect data that we then aim to interpret and aggregate. We overall plan to have 85% of the grid remotely controlled by 2023, and essentially have 100% of all our critical assets remotely controlled as well. The data that we will be able to aggregate will run through some AI programs that we're developing, and this will not only help basically optimize our maintenance and be more predictive in the requirements of maintenance, but will actually also help support our decision making on a day-to-day basis and give us a much more rapid response in case there are issues that require for intervention. We're also launching a pilot project to use blockchain technology to support trading on the PSV. As you know, we're responsible for a lot of the I would call back office activities that are happening that are currently generating a lot of paperwork. So as we go to blockchain, that will make the process a lot leaner, also for the shippers, and a lot cheaper for the market participants. This will significantly lower transaction costs. The 400 million investments in the new businesses is also part of what we call Snamtech, and that has to do with the energy transition. So, taken together, our projects on the sustainability of our operations will deliver a 40% reduction in overall emissions. This is starting from a 2016 base of around 1.5 million tons of CO2 equivalent Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. Of this number, about half is proper CO2 emissions, and the other half is a CO2 equivalent of the methane emissions. For those who are interested, we apply a factor of 28 to compare CH4 emissions to CO2 emissions, which we believe is the industry standard. About 90% of the overall reduction comes from our dual fuel compressor station project, and these numbers, of course, are based on our own assumptions of the network flows and utilization, and the new methane leakage target that we've given to 2025. The remainder of the reduction is a consequence of the increase in the renewable energy that we will use in our system, the efficiency that we apply to building, and the additional progress on methane emissions that we expect to continue beyond this 2025 target of also reducing them by 40%. Turning now to our new energy transition businesses, these are aimed at promoting but also at enhancing Snam's exposure to these very businesses. On the one hand, we want to help grow them, and on the other hand, we want to have an exposure to them. The gas-powered mobility through CNG and LNG replacing diesel and petrol is a secular trend that we will see globally. This is driven by the very big arbitrage there is today globally between gas prices and petrol and diesel prices at the wholesale level. Gas today costs about a third of gas oil on an equivalent energy basis. And it also reduces emissions by 40% and essentially eliminates the particulate that clogs up our cities. Promoting this new valuable role for gas and the biomethane to fully decarbonize it gives us exposure to a sector with growth prospects, which needs immediate capital deployment to reach long-term objectives, and where our skills can really make a difference. At the same time, as we promote this sector, we're also adding value to our network. Here we're working closely with national and European institutions to ensure that this activity is carried out in full accordance with the relevant regulatory and legislative frameworks. We've developed business models which target high single, low double-digit returns for these businesses, given that they're either backed by long-term contracts or incentives, and they overall have a risk profile, as I mentioned, that's similar to that of our regulated businesses with zero or very limited commodity exposure. The potential in both biomethane and CNG is clearly there. Following the decision by the Italian government to incentivize 1.1 BCM of biomethane for mobility and the long-term potential for up to 12 BCM by 2040, as identified by the Snam Terna joint scenario, there is now growing and significant interest in this business. The urban organic waste business model is taking off quite quickly, and the agricultural one is also beginning to grow, but will require more effort to organize and streamline supply chain. The mobility sector in CNG is also moving rapidly. We are pleased to note that there have been over 100,000 new CNG car registrations in the last couple of years, supporting the role of natural gas as a sustainable mobility fuel. Over the same period, and we believe it's helped propel this growth, there have been 200 new stations built, of which more than 150 are directly connected to our network. In this market environment, our biomethane and CNG businesses are progressing well. In biomethane, we see our role as a key market enabler to develop the market so it can reach its long-term potential. Our strategy is built here on two platforms, Renner Waste and Iniziative Biometano. One is for urban waste and one is for agricultural products. We've recently acquired these businesses and we will grow them and invest in them, also leveraging our EPC capabilities that we had acquired through our subsidiary Yes Biogas. Overall here, our goal is to build 40 megawatts of capacity. Of these, 19 are already fully authorized. On this business, we target a double-digit return, benefiting from the incentivized green gas production. As you know, this incentive applies to the mobility sector. Looking at CNG, we've built 6 CNG and 2 LCNG, which are joint LNG and CNG stations, and we expect to build a further 150 over the plan period with investments of around 50 million euros. Our business model here consists in building, leasing, and operating the infrastructure in the filling station, being remunerated through long-term contracts with credit-worthy partners. These contracts provide a floor, and we then have, based on the type of contract, but we have some upsides linked to the volume if they go over a certain predetermined amount. The other leg of our gas for mobility strategy is based on LNG, where demand is growing quite rapidly. We're planning to build and operate 2 micro liquefaction plants that will be directly connected to our grid. We believe that this provides LNG in parts of the country at a cheaper cost than LNG that otherwise would have to be imported from some of the other European regasification terminals, and we think that by making these investments, we will also help boost this new source of gas consumption. At the same time as we build these micro liquefactors, we can also leverage our enhanced exposure to Italian regasification capacity. As I mentioned, we've bought a stake in Adriatic LNG and in Alt, and these, together with Panigaglia, can contribute to provide additional volumes of LNG for transport. Overall, in this business, we expect to invest around 50 million euros, which is in line with last year's plan. Energy efficiency is a fast-growing market for us. It's facilitated and backed by a generous fiscal incentive, which in Italy is called Eco Bonus. This is done to support all the energy efficiency investments. 2 years ago, we acquired TEP. TEP offers buildings an ability, not only we do carbon assessments, carbon footprint assessments, but it allows and facilitates the deep renovation of buildings to make them more energy efficient. Our competitive edge in this sector compared to some of the subscale smaller players which operate in the market is that we can essentially make the upfront Capex investments for the renovation, and then we can offset that with our tax credit for 5 or 10 years. So we can get involved and substitute essentially the tenants in the building and take it all on our balance sheet, which allows for a much faster and leaner decision process and a much more attractive proposition to the tenants of the building. We have already signed contracts worth 60 million of revenues, and we have a very interesting growing pipeline, and we are open to potential partnership with third-party investors in this business. Overall, revenues in 2019 are expected already to be 20 million euros and will continue to grow. Here we target a high single-digit return. Turning now to hydrogen. As many of you know, we're strong believers in the prospects of hydrogen. Workshops at our event in Rome, which some of you have attended, confirmed to us, talking directly to some of the manufacturers of electrolyzers who were present, that the potential for cost reduction is steep and is quite quick. We've also gathered and heard very explicit support and interest from many institutions and key policymakers from Europe and from further beyond. In Snam, we're really addressing the hydrogen opportunity working on three sectors. The first is to make sure that our assets are ready, are hydrogen ready, which for us means essentially accommodating higher blends. You know that we started experimenting with a 5% blend that's now moving to 10% in the pipeline. We're now studying a 5 to 10% mix in our compressors as well. We're looking in the market, scouting for technologies and machines that can reach even higher percentages. The big outstanding question in our asset portfolio remains around storage, and the question here is how hydrogen interacts with some of the bacteria that are present in the reservoir below the ground, and we're doing work on that, working in partnership with other companies as well, and continuing to promote and run studies. We're very excited about the opportunity of membranes. These are instruments that can be inserted in the pipeline and can use the relative difference in size of the molecules of H2 versus CH4 to essentially filter out the methane from the hydrogen or vice versa, and essentially allow us to blend in the network that we know can take big percentages of blend and then separate it if we need customers who may want either pure hydrogen or pure CH4 methane or a mix of the two. So it really adds flexibility to the system. That's the first part. The second leg of our work is around the system design. This is about understanding how the transition will actually work, the overall potential, the costs, what different countries are doing, the benchmarking, some of the studies that you've seen, and essentially what type of infrastructure is required for the market to really take off. And here we also work coordinating other industry participants and working proactively with policymakers in many countries. The third leg is to position Snam to begin developing real hydrogen projects. These can be pilots, these can be partnerships, these can be, I would call it venture capital type opportunities to invest in leading technologies, like essentially we have done for biomethane, where we see that insourcing and investing in a technology is then an enabler of becoming a market participant. We have organized ourselves with a business unit dedicated to hydrogen, and we've built a team in Snam that essentially focuses just on hydrogen. Turning now to our international businesses, these have been an outstanding investment for Snam. They have consistently performed above the business plans that have been used for the acquisitions of these businesses. They've generated a total cash return above 10% a year on average, and we expect to continue to make strong return on these businesses, targeting over 10% across the planned period. Also thanks to the value added that Snam can bring to these businesses, not only operationally, but now, for instance, that Terega has been de-risked from a regulatory point of view. We can think about a refinancing, and we can bring value added also on the balance sheet management side of things. By the end of the plan, we will have essentially recovered the acquisition cost for most of the portfolio, excluding TAP and DESFA, who are more recent acquisitions. Looking at net income, we confirm the target we gave last year of 160 million in 2022. In 2023, we will see the expiry of some of the long-term contracts in TAG, and this may lead to some headwinds in that year on the bottom line. Flows are expected to remain strong on TAG, and we will look for ways to mitigate the headwinds resulting from the contract expiry. I will now hand over to Alessandra for a closer look at our efficiency program and our balance sheet.
Thank you, Marco. Our efficiency plan has delivered above expectations, both in speed and scope, as core costs in 2019 are expected to be already 26 million lower than in 2016, and continues to represent an important source of value creation. We target overall saving of above 65 million by 2023 in our core business compared to 2016, up from our initial target of 25 million when this plan was launched. As you can see, there are a few examples in the slide over the life of the plan of how we have reached and enhanced our overall efficiency plan. New technologies have been a source of saving. We have invested in new IT infrastructure that requires less maintenance and in satellites patrolling of our network that will allow to more efficiently monitor it. Thanks to the expected savings of 50 million year end, 50 million cumulated by year end, and a further 15 million plus to come, costs in our core business before pass-through and one-offs will be lower in real terms in 2023 compared to 2016, even accounting for labor cost inflation and new regulated activities. Looking at our balance sheet, focus remains on de-risking our business plan and improving the solidity of our capital structure. Over the past 3 years, we've focused on taking advantage of the benign market environment to accelerate the reduction of cost of debt, also via 3 liability management exercises. Carrying out pre-funding exercises to lock in current favorable market conditions, as testified by the early September 1.1 billion euro pre-funding of 2020 maturities. Extending the tenor of banking facilities while reducing costs at the same time, and pursuing a very attractive funding condition coupled with extremely long tenor thanks to institutional lender support, as demonstrated by the further 300 million new funding obtained by the EIB in 2019. Moreover, in the context of Snam growing attention to sustainability, we decided to seek sustainable financing both from banks and debt capital markets, aligning our funding with our strategy while diversifying our investor base. Cost of debt is expected at circa 1.4% over the plan horizon, below last year's assumption of 1.8, thanks to the actions already implemented to lock in favorable market conditions, and of course the improved market scenario in both interest rates and credit spreads. This does not include the potential upside linked to treasury optimization actions, such as those executed over the last few years. Moreover, we believe that our refinancing needs could offer opportunities for some further funding cost saving, thanks to further treasury optimization via recourse to uncommitted credit lines and commercial papers, the latter reaching 2 billion at the end of September 2019, opportunistic approach in maturity profile management, further diversification of investors thanks to our sustainable financing, and normalization of country risk premium, supporting the natural bond rollover. Snam's solid credit quality is confirmed by the strong oversubscription of our September dual tranche bond and by credit spread trading well below that of the sovereign. In this regard, we highlight that the net debt to RAB will remain well below 60%, corresponding to a Moody Baa1 rating, which continues to remain our reference. We expect the net debt to RAB ratio essentially unchanged compared to today. This excludes the rating agency's adjustment connected to the project finance related to construction guarantee on TAP that is expected to be released over the plan horizon. Our capital structure leaves us some headroom in terms of leverage, which give us flexibility for potential additional investments not included currently in the plan. We will continue to apply our strict financial criteria when evaluating any opportunity. As a reminder, we will only invest at or above the risk-adjusted return available on regulated organic Capex, and we are committed to our current credit rating metrics and risk profile. Furthermore, we assess opportunities based on whether they enhance the value of our existing asset and infrastructure, allowing Snam to play an industrial role, or support additional growth or strategic optionality. On the back of these criteria, we have already invested or earmarked around 4 billion euro in organic Capex, energy transition investment, bolt-on acquisition, or additional cash return to shareholders through increased dividend policy and buyback. Going forward, we will look carefully at investment opportunities which have a strategic coherence with assets we already own in Europe, or that provide entry points into new gas markets with a view of generating further potential opportunities. Focusing on shareholder returns, we have restarted our buyback program. We have commissioned the first 150 million tranche and have a total of 500 million authorized by our EGM. I will now hand back to Marco for a look at our improved targets.
Thank you, Alessandra. The strategy we've outlined today delivers an enhanced earnings profile and superior shareholder returns over the plan period. The tariff RAB will grow by an average 2.5% a year, confirming the previous plan trajectory despite the lower inflation. The RAB growth will support the revenues, which also benefit from the contribution of additional non-RAB based output incentives expected in 2020 and the new businesses. This, coupled with the focus on the cost containment and efficiency that Ale talked about, will drive EBITDA growth of over 3% per year. Additional efficiencies on the financial costs will further accelerate this growth at the net income level to above 4% per year. The buyback that we've already executed and that which we have announced today will raise our EPS target to 5.5%. Our EPS, just so you know, continues to assume that our convertible bond doesn't convert at this stage. So, to sum up, the key metrics in our plan have been confirmed or improved compared to last year. Looking more closely at 2020, this will be another year of growth driven by continuing investments in our regulated asset base and the initial contribution of the new businesses lines. These will be compensated by the normalization of the contribution from the international associates that we said was extraordinary in 2019. Looking ahead, overall, we're continuing to make good progress on our strategy. We have long-term visibility on sustainable RAB growth to 2030, driven by the replacements. Gas demand continues to grow above expectations, with additional upside coming from the coal phase-out. Green gases are now seen widely as a key component and enabler of the energy transition, and Snam is acquiring, building, developing industry-leading capabilities in many of these new sectors. Overall, we believe that we're ideally positioned to continue to deliver our industry-leading RAB growth, but we also feel that on top of that, the exposure that we've built to the energy transition, the technologies, the platforms, the competences that we've insourced and developed provide a significant upside potential as the decarbonization effort continues to gain momentum. Thank you very much for your attention. We're happy to take any question.
Excuse me, this is the Chorus Call conference operator. We will now begin the question and answer session. Anyone who wishes to ask a question may press star and one on their touchtone telephone. To remove yourself from the question queue, please press star and two. Anyone who has a question may press star and one.
May I ask you to say your name and your company name before taking the question? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Gabriela. Many thanks for taking my question. Javier Suarez at Mediobanca. 3 questions. The first one is on the Capex increase and the effect on your financials. Capex has been increased by 14%, equaling 800 million euros, and then the profile for the company growth in terms of EBITDA and net income has remained broadly unchanged. If you can help us to understand why the company, that increase in Capex doesn't materialize in higher growth through the P&L. Then the second question is on the adjusted net debt to RAB is at 53% by the end of the business plan, and you mentioned again that you could be happy with that level of debt at 60%. Why the company has decided not to be more generous on the dividend side? So the dividend commitment has remained unchanged at 5% CAGR to 2022. Why the company has not extended that to 2023, or why the company has not considered to be more generous on the dividend side, given the space you have on the balance sheet? And the third thing that I was interested in is on the contribution from new businesses. In the previous business plan, you were mentioning a total of 250 million euros coming from output incentives, 150, and then global solutions, 100 million euros in the previous business plan. I think it was 250, made of 150 and 100. So how these numbers are feeding the new business plan? Many thanks.
Okay, thank you, Javier. So I will answer all three, and then Ale, please fill in if you feel you want to. On the Capex side, it simply has to do with the phasing. So some of the Capex that is then turned into RAB is coming at the end of the period. So I don't think there's anything special in some of that EBITDA growth will come later. Maybe Ale, you have more detail of that, and then there is of course the inflation, which has been lowered. If you're comparing this plan to the previous plan, we used to have a 1.1 deflator number in the previous EBITDA guidance, and now we have the 0.9 on the EBITDA. On the dividend question, as we look at our European peers, I mean, 4 years is a very long time to give such a precise outlook for dividend, and so we feel that's the right number for where we are in terms of visibility. We don't look at the balance sheet for dividend. We look more at the payout, and we think we're in a very comfortable zone. As we said, when this stabilizes, we were at above 90, now we're below 75, so we think that is an interesting place to be. We've announced the buyback as well. That's another way of using the balance sheet and some of the financial flexibility to return resources to shareholders, and I think the overall dividend level is at the top of our peers as well, at the top of the range. Looking at the revenues, nothing has changed compared to last year, so don't think that because we don't have that 250 something has changed. In our plan, what we expect from the non-RAB output is the same. The reason we took that number out is because we were getting a lot more questions than answers, because it was a cumulated revenue number comparing apples and oranges, and I think you did the maths right to split it, and then people were asking us what the marginality was on the businesses, which of course is very different if you look at the Snam Global Solutions and if you look at the non-RAB revenues. What I think we can say, if you want a little more detail on the new businesses, so let's say keep the old businesses where they were. On the new businesses, what you should read in the numbers we've given is about 400 million of investments in the energy transition, and a target, as I said, of high single, low double digit. So if you use that as a proxy for what to expect in 2023, I think that can be a fair calculation to be done. Of course, some of these businesses will not be consolidated, so I think to look at the net income is better than to try to look at the EBITDA. I don't know if I've answered your questions.
Good morning, Stefano Gambrini, Equita SIM. 3 questions, if I may. First of all, regarding the financial flexibility, how big is this financial flexibility and how could you use it? I'm particularly interested, how much can you spend to enter new markets that you just said? In the press release, you reported some reference regarding US market, Chinese market, so how could, not regarding the investment, but just regarding the market that are going quite well, if you can spend a few words about how you can spend out of Europe. The second question regarding still the dividend policy. You said the payout is more important for us. In the past, if I remember well, it was 80% a sort of ceiling in terms of payout. Could we think that this could be something, a ceiling also for 2023 payout? And the third regarding the regulation. could you give us a sort of sensitivity, or what are, in your view, the main risk in terms of the regulation update that should arrive in 2022 in terms of allowed WACC? Today, the regulator for the water kept unchanged the floor at 0.5% real return in terms of risk-free, and if this is the main question mark you have in terms of set a dividend policy for 2023. Thanks.
Thank you, Stefano. So on the financial flexibility, I think it's easy for you to calculate it based on the slide that Ale gave. You can put it at 60% or just below 60% and see where we showed we end up. So that's an easy number. In terms of how we use it, we have I think been quite precise in outlining what our investment criteria are. We have said that Ale just said she wants, and we want to keep the current credit metrics. We want to make a risk-adjusted return that's greater than what we make on the Italian regulated businesses. And we want to have, let's say, an industrial angle. And then we've gone further to actually define what that industrial angle means, which is either we have an industrial role where we can bring value to that asset, or that opportunity is an habilitator for additional add-ons, whether they are greenfields or non-greenfields, that becomes a platform to additional growth. Or, like we did for the Edison acquisitions, it's something which is, let's say, adjacent to our existing assets. And I would argue that also DESFA, through TAP, it will become adjacent, so it's actually an enhancement of our assets. So I think it's hard to be more precise, but we've, I think, outlined essentially the way we think about this. And I would add, and it was more implicit in our slide, that we're constantly matching the organic growth. You saw an increase in the organic Capex, the non-organic, and the buyback, where we said many times the buyback we like a lot because we're essentially accreting our RAB. We're paying a premium over the RAB, but we're also saving on the dividend over the shares that we buy back, that in a basically 3-year period can kind of compensate the RAB premium. So we're essentially accreting the RAB over time. So I think that's the way we think about that. Regarding the dividend, the payout remains essentially flat over the period. If you do, you will work this out quickly this afternoon as you do the math. So I think the 80% ceiling is, unless you expect, but I'm not guiding for this, something magic to happen in 2023. I think we're far away from that ceiling. But I do think that 90% was too high. And I've said this before, and I do think that where we are today is a much more comfortable place to be. Regarding regulation, we assume the WACC stays flat. We have, as I mentioned, a constructive dialogue with the regulator. The way they treated the movement in the spreads has been fair, even if the period was quite volatile. I think what will happen to the WACC will be more of a function of how the spread and the risk-free rates will evolve between now and when the observation period kicks in. So we stayed flat, and that's the kind of the assumption that we make. Well, I think, Gabri is pointing out that the assumptions we make, of course, are consistent with today's forward curves.
Hi, good afternoon. Enrico Bartoli from MindFirst. One question is regarding your indication of 1% per year growth in RAB beyond the plan period. If you can elaborate a bit on which assumptions you have to give this kind of guidance, and actually the risk that you see, since we are going, let's say, in the medium term rather than over the next 5 years. A second question is related to Sardinia. If you can give us the amount of Capex you include in your Capex plan, and if you can give us an update on the regulatory and political risk on the execution of the Capex that you expect. Then I have a question for the CFO on the evolution of net debt by at the end of 2020. There is some increase compared to the guidance for this year. If you can guide us the evolution. I guess there is, of course, the buyback, but if there are any effects. And also you mentioned the possible impact from the guarantee for TAP. Can you give us some details on this?
Okay, good. So we have a 10-year plan. That's a formal document that's presented to the government and the regulator on a rolling basis, and so the RAB growth comes from that. I see perhaps some upside potential as some of the methodology that I've began to indicate around the replacement becomes firmer. The discussion is ongoing. We are presenting a methodology plan to the regulator by the end of the year. So in 2020, I think we will have a clearer picture of how to approach those, where, as I've indicated, we want to, on the one hand, make sure the asset is in the right health from all points of view, and we also want to make sure we're not replacing pieces of network that don't need to be replaced. So I think that balancing has not happened yet in a precise way, and so I think as we continue to see the aging of the network, I think there will be more opportunity on the upside than risks on the downside. Regarding Sardinia, I said 400 million is in the plan numbers that you have seen. The cost-benefit analysis is extremely robust. People in Sardinia right now are using GPL mainly for heating, which has a commodity price of more than 3 times that of gas. So there's a very strong push from the people there to bring on board gas. So I think the question that there will be gas is no longer a question. Some people still think that the coastal deposits may suffice. Our strong argument is that if you only rely on coastal deposits, you have a very fragile system, and we've seen in other instances where you have very small niche markets, it's going to be hard to bring the full value to the consumers. So the cost-benefit analysis essentially needs a backbone and a way to connect this backbone with Italy that in the first phase could be via a dedicated LNG ship. So I think there are always, as in any of these projects, some risks around the authorizations, but progress is underway, and I think the people from Sardinia deserve to have energy at the same costs as others, and there's also industrial risks of not lowering the cost of energy in Sardinia. Net debt.
On net debt, of course, that reflects the announced 150 million buyback, which we will carry out over the coming few months. And also, you should consider that we expect closing of ALT to take place in the first Q, which again will increase versus the organic, so to speak, leverage ratio. When it comes to the guarantee of TAP, that is something that has been growing with our exposure in terms of equity and the construction to the infrastructure. And as all project finance, you do have as a shareholder a construction guarantee, which gets released once it gets into operation. So that's effectively something that has been always adjusted from a rating standpoint. Our metrics, it has just grown relevance as the construction period gets toward the final, the finish line. So you will get the release of this once it gets through operation. Us and all shareholders is just the same structure.
Operator, may we now take 3 questions from the conference call, please?
The first question from the conference call is from Harry Wyburd with Bank of America. Please go ahead.
Hi everyone, it's Harry Wyburd from Bank of America. 3 questions from me, please. So the first one is just a follow-up or return to the M&A strategy. I know you talked about it briefly before, but I just wanted to zoom in on the role of the Americas in your potential M&A strategy. And I know you don't comment on specific deals, so this is just a very general question. Obviously, on your page 23 in the slide deck, you illustrated that you've got a very good track record in European or largely European M&A. So what is it that's perhaps triggered the US or the Americas to crop up a bit more in the press in terms of your potential plans? Is it because you feel like the number of opportunities available in Europe is reducing? Or is it because you feel like the returns on offer within regulated assets in Europe are perhaps falling because of more harsh regulatory action? and that returns are actually higher in the US? Or is there a different reason why the Americas is showing up? So the question in simple terms is the US a more attractive environment now relative to Europe for M&A? Second one's just a relatively straightforward one. You mentioned that the tag contract had an expiry in 2023. If you could just quantify how much that could be worth to your associate income. And then the final one's on space heating. So on your page 7, you showed that buildings, which I presume is mostly heating, is about 40% of gas consumption in Italy. If we talk to some of your electricity-focused peers across Europe, you tend to get quite gushing views about heat pumps, about how fantastically efficient they are, how they're going to lead to the full electrification of heat, how they're all NPV positive, and so on. Obviously, you're perhaps slightly on the other side of that debate. So I wondered, what is your view on the electrification of heat? Is that something that you think is plausible in the short run? And do you have any views on how the latest heat pumps, in terms of efficiency, compared to using natural gas? Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks, Harry. So on M&A, I think you're right. We don't comment on specific situations, nor do we comment on specific geographies. I think when you think about us, you should. We're attracted in markets, whether it's for global solutions to do consulting services or to bring our biomethane and energy efficiency and CNG. We're interested in the gas markets that are growing. So we have an office in Beijing to develop our capabilities there. Maybe we start with a consulting opportunity. We've signed a number of MOUs. In fact, we've issued our first invoice last week out of our Beijing office, which is a very exciting moment for us. And so we're developing relationships with NOCs and with growing markets. And as we look at North and South America, we see significant opportunities for many of the things that we do, including the natural gas mobility. As I mentioned, the arbitrage, and I cannot stress this enough, but the fact that petrol and diesel cost 3 times natural gas, and in America they cost even 5 times natural gas because of the lower costs of natural gas due to shale. There will be a very significant shift in infrastructure from petrol and diesel to natural gas vehicles for the pickups, the trucks, the trains, as well as electric, of course, which will continue to grow. Around the tag expiry, so I mentioned that we expect volumes to remain stable. Of course, that's a key route for Russian gas into Italy and into Europe, so we have no question on the volume. There's a mixture of the contract expiry and some of the regulatory reviews that are taking place. So I don't want to be too specific because of the ongoing discussions and sensitive nature of the discussions that we have. But overall, if you take our 160 million 2022 targets, you can probably factor in, if we're not successful in mitigating some of the actions, maybe a 5-7%, 8% fall from in 23 compared to 22. Looking at heating, of course, if you look at southern Italy or South Europe, heat pumps work very well indeed. If you look at North Italy, they have greater difficulty in the colder climates. We have debated this at length with Terna, especially in the decentralized scenario that we showed before. There is a lot of growth in the electrification, and some of that is driven by the heat pumps. Overall, I think the electrification that we have today is around 25%, and I think with Terna we see it growing to 35% by 2040. So there is a significant increase in electrification, but we also see, because of that growth in the green molecules, as we showed, we see demand be quite stable. I think if you want to get more technical, we're happy to do so. Some of the latest thinking is that you will have electric heat pumps combined with either a hydrogen or natural gas-based boiler for those cold days. What's always very important to remind everyone is that the winter energy consumption is, in the case of Italy, 6 times greater in the winter than it is in the summer. If in the case of northern Italy, some regions is 15 times greater in the winter than it is in the summer. And so not only you have to put in the heat pump, but then you need to think about how to store the electricity for that heat pump from the summer when we have a lot of sun to the winter when we have a lot less sun and in some places maybe 10 times the demand. So that's where we think that hydrogen really comes in. So we may lose some domestic natural gas market, but we may recover that market through storage as power to gas and hydrogen storage become a key feature of the combined, let's say, molecule and electricity network. Not combined, but the kind of sector coupling and the greater interconnections.
Okay, many thanks.
Good morning. Good morning. Good morning.
We take another one from the call and then come back to the floor.
Cool.
Excuse me. The next question is from Olivier Van Duzele with Exane. Please go ahead.
Yes, good morning. Thank you very much for taking our questions. My side is two actually. The first one is on the I guess the degree of confidence in the guidance. Although I guess I can't really ask you if you think you will do better than what you guide for. But effectively, when we see that you sort of roll forward by 1 year your guidance on net income, despite the fact that you're spending more on unregulated activities, you're indicating that you expect the cost of debt to be lower than the previous plan. 2019 probably also as a starting point ends up being better than what was in the previous plan, and you also focus on more efficiency. Should we take the absence of an upgrade on a net income guidance for the medium term as an element of caution? Or on the other hand, would you say that this actually reflects the fact that 2023 may be a bit more complicated, for instance, because of what you said on the TAP pipeline? And then the second question is about your international M&A strategy, so that we can see quite well maybe on how buying European infrastructure adjacent to yours could create some synergies and therefore raise the value of the whole. How can you guarantee that actually entering into new markets there will be a similar level of value creation when we think about the fact that the assets you might go after are quite praised among other type of more financial investors who would probably be willing to pay some relatively high multiples, and maybe also how do you think about the potential risk that once you start to diverse yourself too much, if your associate stakes start to be quite widespread, that eventually people might actually end up putting a sort of a holding discount on the value of your shares? I wonder how you think about that, please.
Okay, thank you. So if I understand well, your first question is related to 2023 net income and why the increase is less than you could have obtained by just adding the efficiency and the Capex increase. Is that correct?
Yes, in the lower cost of debt.
Yeah. So actually, the cost of debt is increasing due to the forward curves that we apply today. So the average cost of debt is increasing over the plan period. As I mentioned before, for the EBITDA, we're using a lower deflator than we were last year. So this has an impact on 2023. Of course, this is just an assumption that we're using. We went from 1.1 to 0.9, and so the extra activities essentially compensate for that. Plus, we're starting from a higher base as well. When you talk about the other assets, I think there's two questions that you've asked in this question. One is, how do we make sure we don't destroy value if we go after assets that are attractive to financial investors? And the second is if we have the risk of a holding discount. I basically always go back to the criteria that we have set out. We will only buy an asset if and when we are confident that we can make a better risk-adjusted return than we can on our Italian RAB. So we have basically not participated in many auctions of assets where we see an asset that is fully built out, standalone, mature. Those assets that are appealing for the pure financial investors are simply not interesting for us, because we will never get to the financial criteria that Ale laid out. So I really don't see this as a risk at all. Regarding the holding discount, I indicated briefly, for instance, on energy efficiency, that we are available to discuss third-party investors coming into this type of business. I think it's early to tell, but certainly a business like that, once, if we grow it to a point where it becomes a relevant and meaningful business, I would have nothing against also diluting our exposure to that business. So I don't think it's a question for now, but it could well be a question 5 years from now as these businesses grow. Should we realize that there is a dislocation of value, we will take steps either to show value that is not being noticed, or even deeper corporate finance measures. I think the demerger we did of Italgas is a showcase of our approach to this. Not that it was there was probably a holding discount, but I think just both companies were doing different jobs, and both us and Italgas have performed better since the demerger of that business. I don't know if I've answered your question.
Yes, very clear. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good. Shall I?
Antonella, please.
Okay, hello, it's Antonella from Citigroup. Just one big picture question. I mean, your strategies always compare, how much you can improve the system compared to what we have today in terms of decarbonization and so on. But the request of the industry, of the regulator, of investors is really to understand if developing biogas, investing in network is actually the best solution overall, even comparing to electricity solution. And this is, for instance, what the regulator have asked when discussing Sardinia. So my question is, we obviously don't know, because the technology is evolving. Power price, if gas prices goes down, very likely power prices will go down as well. Technology in the renewable hydrogen to store electricity is another option that could change the picture. So why looking to expand again into the gas when electricity and gas are really converging? So, I think that the best way to protect your assets, your billions that are there for the next 50 years, it would be to integrate your business with the electricity network, because, also to diversify and to optimize. Why this is not an option, if it is not an option, the potential of a merger with Terna, for instance, in order to optimize the development of the energy policy in Italy. And I have other two small questions. One is on Italgas. Italgas is never mentioned. You have a 13.5% in the company. Is it a strategic asset? You think, it could be a disposal to finance something else, or which is its role? And last, which is the contribution of the TAP to your 2020 earnings guidance? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Antonella. So I certainly won't comment on any specific merger or M&A idea. What I can say is that the work on the scenarios that we did with Terna is very, very precious. And I have been working in Enel for many years before spending 11 years in Eni. And since I was in the sector, there have been various attempts to try to say, okay, one view of the world is to electrify as much as possible. The other view is to use molecules, find a balance. And this balance has never been found for at least 15 years. And now finally it's there. So what we have is a very deep and thorough work that has been made publicly available, that is shared and supported by the regulator, I would say also by the government, that really shows what we can do with electrons and what we can do with molecules and how the two can help each other. And what we've announced today regarding the dual fuel compressor stations, I think, goes a long way to show that, in fact, we are electrifying. When I say that we are installing electric capacity, I will generate significant electricity demand. I will cannibalize some gas demand, but that's fine. And essentially, we will have a much more efficient system that can actually help the electricity grid be more resilient and balance it when they need to offload power or when they may need lower power consumption in the area. So I think we are making really good progress in aligning our planning and our ideas. If you look at Sardinia, you mentioned Sardinia, if you talk to Terna, they will say what we say, which is you need both. These are different, there's different markets for the electricity and for the gas. The gas essentially goes to replace the heating that is used in some of the industrial uses and has to support the phasing out of coal. The electricity has uses for serving the current electricity needs. So I think we're making really good progress in being more and more coordinated. Italgas is a great company. It's a well-managed company. We're happy with the way the investment is going. We have no urgency to dispose of this stake. We've said this from day one. We don't consider it a strategic investment either. But it has a similar risk profile to us. It's the same type of business. We understand the business, and it's contributing to our earnings. I actually don't know the contribution of TAP in 2020.
Millions.
A few million positive?
Positive.
Okay, because it depends on the month in which TAP comes in, because it's negative until when it comes in, and then it turns into positive. So I think based on the month we expect is a couple of million positive already in 2020.
Aldo?
So, good morning. Thank you for your presentation. This is Aldo Bonatti from Etica. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So, first, congratulations for the deep integration of ESG in the company strategy. On this regard, it is clear that the company is developing a plan to transition from, let's call it, traditional natural gas to biogas and hydrogen. On this regard, is the recent announcement of the new European Investment Bank climate strategy and energy lending policy having an impact, or is going to have an impact on the execution and the time frame of such a plan?
Thank you, Aldo, for the question. It gives me the opportunity to say and restate what I said in the slide before, that we see the EIB's outcome, which is not necessarily what some people were hoping for, as very positive for Snam. Because what they have essentially said is that they will continue to support gas infrastructure so long as it's used for the green gas, which is exactly what we've been saying before the EIB announcement. So I think it's a further endorsement, if you will, of our strategy, and further demonstrates that this is the trend that is now becoming more mainstream. When we were talking about green gases a few years ago, it was much less established as a feature of the energy transition. So we are very positive and encouraged by the EIB's decision last week.
Please, Bartek.
Hi, this is Bartek Kubicki, Societe Generale. A couple of questions. Firstly, on the future of your assets. Obviously, you are very bullish about the gas demand, gas consumption, whereas the other TSOs in Europe are not necessarily so, and we are actually saying the picture is quite mixed, and some of them, notably National Grid, is even proposing to include the risk of stranded assets into the next regulatory period and to accelerate the depreciation. So my question is related to this, whether there is any discussion whatsoever with the regulator that actually there is a risk of stranded assets, and how would you tackle this? And related to this also, on your 9,000 kilometers of zero wrap pipes, can you actually get remunerated on this somewhat? Like in Spain, for instance, you get extra OPEX credits for having pipes with value of 0. That's the first thing. Second thing, on actually LNG and storage. I remember, Marco, you were always very bullish on storage. Gas prices are quite depressed. storages are full around Europe. So what's your view right now on storage and the value of storage in the future? And related to this, would you also consider a construction of new LNG terminals in Italy? And thirdly, on DESFA, I think by the end of this year you were supposed to provide us with some business plan for DESFA. So I wonder if there's any update on this one, especially given the fact that in Greece you have a number of CCGTs being built right now to replace old and obsolete lignite, which should of course boost gas consumption in the country and should be positive for your assets. Maybe if you can elaborate on this one. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bartek. So let's start with the future. So the view that we highlighted is not my view. This is the view of us and Terna and the regulator, and I would say the government. So it's a very shared view. Italy has historically been a country with a big penetration of gas, and Italy has to phase out coal, something the UK has indeed started doing sooner. So I think if you look at the UK, you have seen a growth in gas demand happen in the previous 3 years, which is what we expect to come to Italy as we approach the phase out in 2025. The UK has essentially phased out coal already. We have no discussion around stranded asset acceleration. I could see why it could be tempting for some to accelerate and shorten the depreciation period. Regarding the 9,000 kilometers that will be left or will be, let's say, fully amortized by the end of the plan, which by the way is the same number we have today, this number will grow based on the current 1% RAB growth kind of 10-year plan that we have. There will be more assets expiring than new assets being built in our current outlook. We have no, not only no regulation, but we have no, let's say, certification of these assets. We're simply operating them, I would say, almost out of inertia. These are assets that are out of the RAB and that we're treating them as if they were in the RAB for all intents and purposes. I quite personally like the Spanish model. I don't necessarily think that will be the model, but what I mentioned before is that we are providing the regulator in these weeks and months with the methodology I've outlined as to how we prioritize what needs to be replaced. We are looking forward to a constructive discussion with them, where I think it's going to be a win-win. Win-win meaning that the system doesn't need, and I will be very strict against any effort to replace what doesn't need to be replaced. But we need to find a way to remunerate that, whether it's OPEX, whether it's adding back some life to it, whether it's agreeing that it has new life. So I think that's quite an interesting discussion that we will have, always with the consumer in mind, always aimed at trying to replace what actually has to be replaced. And so I think that will be interesting. Storage, we've been saying this for many years, that the LNG market will be oversupplied in the summer and quite tight in the winter, and we are working in some of the developing countries with our global solutions business to provide advisory services for more storage, but it's very difficult to build more storages. So you look at Korea, Japan, India, China, they don't have storage, and in the winter they're going to take a lot of gas. In the summer they won't be able to take the gas, and so it's all coming to Europe, which is great news for Europe. It's all coming to Italy, which is great news for Italy. We get cheaper gas and full storage. I think the system is coping quite well, so we don't need today additional regas. But you know, there's still big question marks about the rest of Europe as countries face the combination of coal phase out and nuclear phase out. My expectation, given the progress I'm seeing, and I don't want to pinpoint any specific country, but the progress I'm seeing on for instance, the wind development in certain countries, it's going a lot slower than planned. A lot of the countries in Northern Europe don't have a lot of sun or don't have competitive enough sun, and so I expect gas will have a growing role for sure in the transition period, and I think storage will continue to be extremely, extremely valuable. The DESFA business plan has upside potential. We have now a new government in Greece, and we are in the process, DESFA is in the process of talking to the government and the other shareholders we have and the regulator to approve a new plan, which will be increased. I think there's big opportunity in Greece, where you mentioned on the CCGT front, so there's more volumes coming. There is potential further evolutions of the market there, but there's also potential in small-scale LNG. All the islands of Greece are essentially like Sardinia is, which is using GPL for heating, which from an environmental point of view, but also from a, let's say, savings point of view or kind of cost of energy point of view, doesn't make any sense. So I think there's really big potential to substitute some of that GPL and some of the diesel. A lot of the islands are still running on diesel generators, which is polluting a lot and costing 3 times as much.
Operator, can you can we have another question from the conference call, please?
The next question is from James Brand with Deutsche Bank. Please go ahead, sir.
Hi, good afternoon. Well done on the presentation. It was really interesting, and yeah, well done for leading the debate on some of these issues around energy transition and green gases. I just had a couple of questions on that kind of long-term outlook, but to maybe be a bit more specific around the steps that could be coming over maybe the next 5 years or so, and specifically on biomethane, which is an area you know obviously talked about your efforts to kind of move that forward, and then secondly on green hydrogen. But on biomethane, I was just wondering whether you could set out over the next 5 years what the next steps are. Is it just a case of ramping up production further and being involved in the debate on that, and how far would the incentives that are currently there in Italy, do you think that can get to in 5 years or maybe even 10 years time as a percentage of overall gas use? And then secondly, on the green hydrogen side, you had some interesting numbers showing the costs coming down, and the two elements of that being the electrolyzer Capex and the potential cost of renewables. But I was also interested there in what you felt the next steps are. Is it a case of just trying to lobby government to try and support grants or incentives for more electrolyzers to be built in Italy to try and commercialize that technology and bring the cost down, or are you more happy to allow that to be happening kind of elsewhere around the world and maybe taking advantage of that once that technology gets commercialized elsewhere? And then specifically on the estimates for the costs, which come down very dramatically, I'm just wondering how confident we can be around any kind of estimates of the long-term cost of electrolyzers at the moment, or whether that's speculative, or how speculative it is. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot, James. These are great questions. So the biomethane, let's focus on Italy. Italy has a current incentive of 1.1 BCM. This is all paid for by, let's say, the car fuels. So it's an incentive that goes as part of the biofuel policy. The 1.1 billion equates to more or less 500 megawatts of installed capacity. We mentioned that we target 40 megawatts, so it's less than 10% market share, and we said that we will invest 250 million euros to do so. There could be upside for us as these platforms that we've purchased and the pipelines that we're seeing. There could be upside to our investment and our exposure, but as you see, it's a relative share. Also because we see the full potential of biomethane is 12 billion cubic meters. Is this 2040 or 2040? So as I thought, 2040 we see a full potential of 12 billion cubic meters. So that would be over 5 gigawatts of installed capacity. So it's a big market, it's growing, it will have to be incentivized. It requires the types of skills that we have, and so we quite like it. And the same is happening in other countries in Europe. We see a number of countries increasing and making the incentives more attractive. Hydrogen is, let's start with the electrolyzer numbers. So we performed a lot of work with a consulting firm. That work is publicly available. We have published a book on the way in which we calculated the cost reduction. Bloomberg has done some excellent work as well. You can find that. It's a consequence of interviewing all the producers, saying, how will the cost come down if we scale the production up? And they all indicated a 6, 7, 10, some people said 10-fold decline in production. So we've taken a 7 times reduction in 2050, which we think is quite prudent, actually, compared to some of the other estimates that are out there. And if you look at how these kits are made, it's really like a handmade car. This is almost like plasma screens, how they were made 15 years ago when they cost $20,000 a piece, and now they cost a couple of $100 a piece. One of the policy ideas that we've proposed and that other TSOs are sharing is that by forcing a blend, as we've shown it can be done, by forcing a blend, even a small blend of just 7%, could create enough demand for electrolyzers to then help the whole market benefit from the fall in price resulting from the creation of demand. We also think Europe needs an industrial strategy to try to preserve technology and jobs in Europe. And so it's a little bit replicating what Europe and really Italy and Germany and a bit Spain and the UK did for solar, but trying to first avoid the very big costs for the solar subsidies, and second to avoid having all the technology go offshore. And so I think a combination of trying to make it as cheap as possible to scale up the demand and as industrially sound as possible for Europe to preserve jobs and technology, I think that's what we advocate for.
We also have some questions from the web. So, Jose, I think we already answered to your question, and Matteo, we answered already to the first two, but we still have the third one.
So I think there's a question here from Matteo Rodolfo from Goldman Sachs, who asks whether the TAG GCA volumes would be affected if the Ukraine Gazprom gas transit deal is not renewed. So no, they would not be affected. There will be, and there have been increasing volumes of Russian gas coming into Europe. If the flows in the Ukraine are reduced, it's because the Nord Stream 2 is on stream, and the Nord Stream 2, as you know, lands into Germany, so it would then come into Italy through Baumgarten as well. I don't know if I've answered your question. Okay.
I think we have the last question from the conference call.
Gentlemen, there are no more questions registered from the call.
Good. Okay, well, if that's it, if there's no more I think there's maybe a follow-on question from the...
Sorry, just one quick follow-up question. Regarding the output-based incentives and global solution revenues that in the previous plan were 250 million euros up to 2022, what is this amount in this plan?
Yeah, as I said before, assume the same. Assume the same, more or less, yeah. There's no change. It's just it was an odd aggregation of businesses and a target, so we just decided to not re-emphasize that. Okay, so thank you all very much for having come, and I think there are copies available of the gas report and the hydrogen book for those who are interested. Thanks for being here.
La qualità della vita è strettamente legata all'energia. Ma il nostro modello di sviluppo e l'utilizzo delle risorse energetiche non sono più sostenibili. Dobbiamo decarbonizzare il pianeta puntando su energie rinnovabili e pulite. La nostra strategia per uno sviluppo sostenibile punta su gas rinnovabili come l'idrogeno. L'idrogeno è un elemento chimico essenziale ed è il più abbondante nell'universo. Può essere prodotto dal calore del sole e dalla forza del vento, per fornire energia pulita a case, mezzi di trasporto, industrie, ovunque nel mondo. Può essere facilmente trasportato e stoccato, sfruttando le infrastrutture esistenti a costi contenuti. Snam sta affrontando questa sfida mettendo in campo tecnologie e competenze. Perché quello che facciamo oggi darà vita al pianeta di domani. Snam. Energy to inspire the world.